I've pulled the last of the year's young onions. The garden is bare now. The ground is cold, brown and old. What is left of the day flames in the maples at the corner of my eye. I turn. A cardinal vanishes. By the cellar door, I wash the onions, then drink from the icy metal spigot. Once, years back, I walked beside my father among the windfall pears. I can't recall our words. We may have strolled in silence, but I still see him bend that way, left hand braced on knee, creaky, to lift and hold to my eye a rotten pear. In it, a hornet spun crazily, glazed in slow, glistening juice. It was my father I saw this morning, waving to me from the trees. I almost called to him until I came close enough to see the shovel leaning where I had left it in the flickering, deep green shade. White rice steaming, almost done. Sweet green peas fried in onions. Shrimp braised in sesame oil and garlic, and my own loneliness. What more could I, a young man, want? I don't know. I used to have a garden in Pennsylvania, and I grew onions, and this is just about, I guess, clearing the onions out and finding some, leftover young onions that were there. But I'm not sure what it's about either. I guess it's about the invention of solitude or the discovery of solitude or uh, loneliness and death. And I wanted somehow to honor food making, which is a continuous mystery to me. This is called eating together. Eating together. In the steamer is the trout, seasoned with slivers of ginger, 2 sprigs of green onion, and sesame oil. We shall eat it with rice for lunch. Brothers, sister, my mother, who will taste the sweetest meat of the head, holding it between her fingers, deftly, the way my father did, weeks ago. Then he lay down to sleep like a snow-covered road, winding through pines older than him, without any travelers, and lonely for no one. Well, I don't blame, young people for being intimidated by poetry, because it seems to me, particularly lyric poetry, I'm not sure that poems belong in the same category as like novels and essays and short stories. Poems are strange. They belong in a whole category of like synchronicity or coincidence. I think experience of coincidence is the closest thing we have to the experience of poetry. In fact, I think a lyric poem is nothing less than the manifestation of coincident order in language. Again, the poem ends in loneliness, and I must have been a young man, fascinated and I don't know, bollocksed by my own loneliness, and I don't know. Well, food is so important to me personally. I'm sure it has to do with my culture. the Chinese culture is obsessed with food, and a lot of information, I think, is passed on from generation to generation by the kinds of food that are passed on, the kinds of food that are the foods that are encouraged and discouraged, and every family has its own recipe for certain things. I had a friend who read this poem about the trout, and he corrected me. He said, "Well, we don't make it with trout; we make it with flounder." And I said, "Well, every family makes it different, So I think with the Chinese tradition, it's very food is a big issue, And it's in my family, particularly, there are 11 of us now, and we get together every evening for dinner, and so that's a big. Every evening, it's a big issue. My brother and his wife and their daughters, and my mother and my sister and her husband and my family, we all get together. We all cook. We all eat together every evening, and there's something very I don't know, the convergence of generations, and that's been really important for years. And my mother's mother used to live with us, and so all of us would converge and eat, and there'd be a lot of storytelling around food, and so it was a really important part of my own growing up. And I know this. I'm Chinese, but I was born in Indonesia. The year I was born, 50,000 Chinese were rounded up and killed. My father was part of that. He was not killed. He escaped. And after he escaped and took his family with him, within a 10-year span, while I was in, the year I was born was right in the middle of a 10-year span in which they killed 500,000 Chinese in Indonesia. And so I grew up with a kind of experience that somehow that was just the world, political upheaval and social unrest, and so when we finally came to this country was at war with an Asian country, which meant, and it wasn't that long ago, but it didn't seem to matter to the people where I was growing up, whether I was Chinese or Vietnamese. I mean, I looked Vietnamese, and a lot of the people, they had lost relatives, uncles and brothers in the Vietnam War, and so a lot of that hatred was directed toward me. And even though I was trying to explain myself, like, no, I'm not Vietnamese, I'm Chinese, you've got the wrong person. I think ultimately the feeling of being outside probably contributed to my, I'm guessing now, very likely contributed to my wanting to write poetry or to make art of any kind, because I think ultimately anybody who wants to make art is somehow outside of things, and it's the experience of being outside, experience of being strange, I think ultimately gets enacted in the poems. I don't know, when I'm writing the poem, I don't know how much I actually experience my own refugee status, I think I experience a kind of dislocation, a kind of strangeness about being on planet Earth. But that might be, that may or may not have to do with my being a refugee, I think my being a refugee is coincident with any soul's experience of being on planet. Maybe any soul is a refugee from heaven, I'm always confused by my own experiences here on Earth, and I think that's I write poems in order to try to understand that experience, And it seems that my life, I've been just looking for a safe place all of my life, a refuge, and it seems to me that language, particularly poetry, is a safe place. is a kind of a shelter and a refuge. And I'm not sure what I mean by that, except it's a visceral experience when I'm writing poems. My own experience is that I'm creating a safe place for myself. It might have something to do with the possibility that my own identity was nearly erased. When I was born, many Chinese lost their lives in Indonesia, and my parents nearly lost their lives, and so maybe that's what writing poetry is about ultimately. It's about discovering who we are, being friends with who we are, getting friendly with your own mind. I think over the years of writing and trying to understand writing, trying to understand or trying to formulate for myself a kind of formal aesthetic point of view, I think the ancient Chinese aesthetic has been the one that has been most influential to me. The whole idea, that poetic mind was a kind of yoga. The ancient Chinese believed that there are kinds of yogas, and that poetry was the royal yoga, that the practice of painting and poetry were the practice of what they called universal mind or cosmic mind. And so that whole belief and thousands of years of that practice in China, I think has influenced me a lot. I guess when I try to formulate some sort of aesthetic, I'm just drawing from Emerson, from Lao Tzu, from the sutras, and from mystical Judeo-Christian traditions, and they all seem to me to point to the same thing, and that is checking your ego and letting something bigger speak in the poem. Well, in my own practice, there are many kinds of poems. Some poems come full blown, and if I make one change, the whole poem is ruined. And so I know, I have to develop a kind of dialogue with the work, so that I listen to the work, and if the work feels like it's whole and it's complete, then I'm done with it. But a lot of times, because I'm not concentrating or my mind isn't as present as it should be, I get pieces of the poem, and so the whole poem doesn't emerge, and so I have to go back and revise. So the poems that I've worked on the longest, it took me 11 years to write, and the poem that I worked on the least, maybe 3 minutes. So anywhere in between that. And it feels to me that I'm on the job 24 hours a day. The minute I wake up, I feel as if I'm in the presence of a poem. The whole cosmos, the whole world seems to exist to me like a giant poem. And I could begin anywhere. And so I'm on the job all the time. I see the beginnings of poems everywhere. It's almost maddening, there's so much to write about. I just don't know where to begin. And there's a kind of grief attached to that too, because I feel there are hundreds of thousands of poems available everywhere I look. But if I start to write, it means that I'm only writing one poem, and all those other poems have to be said no to, And so that whole experience is a weird experience. But it does feel to me that the world exists in a condition of a saturated presence and meaning and being, and sometimes it's difficult just to rescue a poem out of that stream of overabundance of being, just to rescue a little moment's clarity out of that. My own love for poetry came from this discovery that that every time I heard my parents recite ancient Chinese poetry, or the poetry from the Old and New Testaments, that my own experience was that I was hearing language that was manifesting something older and something mysterious and something beautiful and mysterious that I couldn't account for, and I wanted to be a part of that. I remember my parents would sometimes recite beautiful ancient poems, and I could see that they were weeping while they were reciting, which moved me and made me feel actually like I was introduced to some sort of mystery. You know, that my mother would recite something and look away, and I would realize that she was kind of weeping. There were tears in her eyes. And I thought she had this relationship with these poems that I couldn't quite understand, you know. So that fascinated me. I didn't start learning to read poetry in English, although I was reading the Bible, you know. I guess I was reading the Psalms and the Gospels and the book of Genesis and Exodus, and those books just knocked me out. I thought they were weird and mysterious and otherworldly, and there were parts of me. I was able to read, you know, things like Genesis and Exodus that didn't make any rational sense. It didn't bother me, you know. It made figurative sense to me, emotional sense. You know? And I think ultimately those kinds of poets, you know, the poets that I loved, all they propose poetry as a mode of being in the world, which is, I guess, ultimately a religious proposition, right? You know, the religious figures, they propose prayer or contemplation or meditation as a mode of being in the world. It's not just something you do in your room. So I've always been fascinated by poetry that proposes that, you know. I think one has to inhabit a particular state of consciousness in order to notice coincidence or synchronicity in the world. And it could be, in fact, that the more open we are to it, the more we realize, the more we maybe begin to notice that that's the deepest thing going on at any particular time, you know. That cause and effect is a kind of surface condition, but maybe down deep, at a deeper level, at a quantum level of reality. And I do think that writing poems is dealing with language at a quantum level, you know. But it seems to me that when you open your mind to a particular condition or a particular state of consciousness, then the synchronicities and coincidences begin to emerge and begin to yield themselves, it feels to me, begin to reveal themselves in language. And poems are small paradigms, or DNA is the paradigm for a poem. That is, as much information in as little space as possible. And when we read a poem, maybe the mind of the reader is a kind of like a solvent. Like you drop the DNA, which is the poem, in the mind of the reader, and the poem begins to blossom, begins to bloom with all these meanings. But of course, the information I'm talking about in a poem isn't just data, you know, and it's not necessarily autobiographical information. It's emotional information, spiritual information, soulful information, erotic information, intellectual information, all of that stuff packed into a poem. You know, I don't know if this is going to be useful or not, but it seems to me that because a poem is a score for the human voice, a voice implies a speaker. So in a way, every poem is a portrait of a speaker. You know, whatever the ostensible subject of the poem is, the real subject is the speaker. Sometimes we get kind of lost in the ostensible subject. We read a poem, we think, for instance, in Eating Together or Eating Alone. I think those are about eating and all those other things, but I think ultimately what I was trying to construct was a speaking person who had value in the world. And for me, that's been the whole project, is can I create a portrait of a speaker that is precious in the world. You know, the ancient Greeks called it creating a person who, if that person were destroyed, it would be lamentable. We would have to weep. And so that was the ancient Greeks, that was their way of conferring value onto heroes. But I think we don't write about heroes anymore. We write about mind. We write about heart. You know, that's ultimately the subject. And what is the value of the mind in the poem? The quality of the imagination is ultimately what they're encountering in the poem. So that's what I think they should be writing about. They should be interrogating the quality of the imagination in the poem, the quality of the mind, the heart, the soul in the poem.